Sold again for being barren. The Omega froze as the Alpha King chose her before all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Evelyn Hart. The square was already awake when Evelyn was brought forward, though the sun had barely cleared the rooftops. Its pale light catching on iron rails and polished stone, the kind of place meant to make people feel small. The air smelled of cold dust and morning ash, and the gathered crowd stood in a wide half circle, close enough to see her face, far enough to pretend they weren't responsible. Evelyn kept her hands folded, wrists loose, posture quiet, the way she had learned to stand after the first sale, and the second, and the third, when resistance only made things worse. Someone read her name aloud, followed by the word everyone seemed to remember more clearly than her face, Barren, as if it were a title she had earned instead of a sentence passed down without appeal. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, not loud, not cruel enough to be called insults, but sharp in their indifference, the sound of people reassuring themselves that this would never be them. Evelyn stared at the stone ground, counting shallow cracks the way she used to count steps on long roads, because numbers were easier than memories. She remembered the weight of contracts pressed into her palm, the way hope thinned every time she was returned, the careful smiles of buyers who had promised a place, then changed their minds when time passed, and nothing changed. She had learned not to argue with labels, only to survive them. The auction platform stood a few yards ahead, raised just enough to make her visible, and when she stepped onto it, her body reacted before her thoughts could, a faint stillness settling into her limbs, as if even her breath had learned to wait. Someone spoke about utility and value, about futures and expectations, words that drifted past her like weather reports meant for someone else. Evelyn felt the familiar cold behind her ribs, not pain exactly, more like the absence of warmth, the space where wanting used to live. She noticed small things instead, a child tugging at a parent's sleeve before being gently turned away, a banner snapping once in the breeze, the measured distance between her and the crowd, close enough to see, far enough not to touch. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply stood, because standing was what she knew how to do when everything else had been taken. And somewhere beyond the edges of the square, beyond the murmurs and the practiced indifference, something shifted, subtle at first, like pressure changing before a storm, though Evelyn did not look up yet, unaware that this moment, the one she thought would be another ending, was being watched by eyes that saw far more than what she had been sold for. Evelyn remained on the platform longer than necessary, not because anyone told her to stay, but because she had learned that moving too soon invited attention, and attention always came with consequences. The official spoke in measured tones nearby, discussing ledgers and schedules as if she were already gone, and perhaps she was, at least in the way that mattered. She had learned that being barren made her invisible in a very specific way, visible enough to be traded, but unseen as a person, a contradiction she carried quietly like an old injury. Her mind drifted, as it often did in moments like this, back to the first place she had been sent, a modest household near the river where the water smelled clean and the mornings had felt hopeful. They had fed her well, given her work that felt useful, and spoken to her with cautious kindness until the months passed, and the expectation everyone pretended not to measure became impossible to ignore. The return had been polite, almost apologetic, as if disappointment could be softened by good manners. After that, the pattern repeated with small variations, different houses, different faces, the same conclusion written between the lines. Evelyn did not hate them for it. Hate required energy, and energy was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she learned to make herself smaller, quieter, efficient in ways that did not ask for permanence. As the murmurs in the square shifted, she felt the subtle change again, the same pressure she had noticed moments earlier, a tension that did not belong to her but wrapped around the space like an unseen current. She kept her gaze lowered, not out of submission, but habit, because looking up too often led to hope, and hope was dangerous. Somewhere to her left, A voice faltered mid-sentence, not loud enough to draw notice, but enough for Evelyn to register it, the way a person feels a change in weather before the clouds appear. She noticed how the crowd straightened, how conversations thinned, how the air seemed to grow heavier without becoming colder. Years ago, she might have wondered what it meant. Now, she simply waited. Her fingers curled once, then stilled, nails pressing lightly into her palm to anchor herself in the present. She told herself that whatever came next would be manageable, because everything before it had been. She had survived worse than being chosen last. She had survived being chosen at all. The platform beneath her feet felt solid, unyielding, a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still standing in her own body. She thought of nothing and everything at once, of the way her name sounded when spoken without judgment, of the quiet satisfaction of finishing a task well, of the strange calm that settled over her when she accepted that she did not belong anywhere for long. When the crowd shifted again, this time more decisively, a hush spreading outward like ripples across water, Evelyn felt her breath catch, not from fear, but from instinct. Something important was approaching, something that demanded silence without asking for it. And though she did not yet lift her head, every part of her knew that this moment was different, not because it promised rescue, but because it carried weight, the kind that bent the world slightly around it. She stood still, as she always had, unaware that the story others had written for her was about to be interrupted, not by chance, but by choice. Evelyn finally lifted her eyes when the clerk's voice sharpened, not in cruelty but in impatience, repeating the details everyone already knew as if repetition might make them truer. Age, status, condition, the word barren placed carefully at the end like a seal that closed every argument. A few people nodded, relieved to have certainty handed to them, and someone near the back let out a thin laugh that stopped as quickly as it started, swallowed by the growing hush. The clerk cleared his throat and gestured toward the ledger, announcing that this would be her final listing of the season, a practical statement delivered with the false kindness reserved for necessary losses. Evelyn felt the heat rise in her face and settle behind her eyes, not as tears, but as pressure, the kind that made the world feel too close. She told herself to breathe, slow and steady, counting to four the way she had learned on long walks between places that never became home. The crowd leaned in without stepping closer, curiosity tugging at them like a habit they pretended not to have, and Evelyn heard the familiar phrases whispered again. Unlucky, unfortunate, a shame, words that sounded gentle but landed hard. A woman near the front shook her head with sympathy that asked nothing of her, while a man beside her murmured that some omegas simply were not meant to stay, as if fate were a polite explanation instead of a dismissal. The clerk continued, listing terms and conditions in a voice that echoed faintly off stone, and Evelyn felt herself becoming smaller inside her own skin, not from fear, but from the practiced instinct to disappear when being seen only caused harm. She remembered standing in a similar square years ago, younger then, her shoulders tighter, her hope less guarded, and she remembered how that hope had felt when it broke, sharp and sudden, leaving behind a quiet ache that never fully left. Now, she stood straighter, not because she believed in a different outcome, but because she refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her fold. Someone called out a question about guarantees, and the clerk responded with a rehearsed answer about time frames and expectations, his gaze sliding past Evelyn as if she were furniture, necessary, but unremarkable. The pressure in the air thickened again, not louder, not dramatic, just present, and Evelyn noticed how the guards at the edge of the square adjusted their stance, how conversations stalled mid-word, how even the banners seemed to still. The clerk paused, pen hovering above the page, irritation flickering across his face before being replaced by something else, uncertainty. Evelyn felt it then, the way the silence stretched, the way the crowd's attention shifted away from her without releasing its grip, as if drawn by a stronger pull. She swallowed and kept her hand still, her pulse steady despite the sudden awareness that whatever was happening did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of sales and signatures. The clerk cleared his throat again, this time softer, and glanced toward the entrance to the square, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing. Evelyn followed his gaze at last, her heart beating a fraction faster, not with hope, but with recognition, the sense that the rules she had learned to survive by were about to be tested by something that did not care about precedent. The crowd parted slightly, not by command but by instinct, and in that narrow opening, Evelyn felt the weight of attention shift decisively, away from what she was supposed to be, and toward what was arriving, something that made the title she had been given feel suddenly incomplete, as if it were missing a word no one had dared to imagine. Evelyn's attention drifted from the narrowing gap at the edge of the square back to the platform beneath her feet when a quiet sound reached her, a soft, uneven breath that did not belong to the officials or the crowd. She turned slightly and saw a younger Omega standing just below the steps, her shoulders drawn in, hands clasped too tightly, eyes fixed on the ground with the same practiced caution Evelyn recognized immediately. The girl's sleeve had slipped, revealing a faded mark that spoke of past ownership rather than present belonging, and something in Evelyn shifted, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to move her before she could think better of it. She stepped down one stair, careful and unhurried, and placed her own shawl back where it belonged on the girl's arm, a simple gesture meant to cover, not to claim. The girl looked up, startled, her eyes wide with surprise that quickly softened into something like relief, and for a brief moment, the noise of the square faded into the background. Evelyn said nothing. She did not offer comfort or promise anything she could not give. She simply adjusted the fabric and nodded once, as if to say that being seen did not have to hurt. When she stepped back onto the platform, she felt the familiar weight of attention return. Heavier now, edged with confusion. Someone whispered that she was wasting time. Another murmured that kindness did not change outcomes. Evelyn did not argue. She knew better than to try. But she also knew that small things mattered, even when they did not alter the ending everyone expected. The clerk hesitated, glancing between the ledger and the crowd, then resumed his routine with less certainty than before, his voice lacking the earlier rhythm. Evelyn folded her hands again, her pulse steady, the memory of the girl's surprised expression anchoring her more firmly than any rule or label ever had. The pressure in the air built further, subtle but unmistakable now, and she felt it press against her awareness like a held breath. The crowd shifted, their curiosity giving way to something closer to unease, and Evelyn sensed that the moment she had just created, small and unremarkable on its own, had disrupted the neat order everyone relied on. She wondered, briefly, if this was what courage felt like, not defiance or loud refusal, but the quiet decision to act according to one's own measure when no reward was promised. Her gaze lifted again, drawn irresistibly toward the entrance as the hush deepened, and she saw movement there, not hurried, not dramatic, but deliberate, the kind that commanded space without needing to claim it. The square seemed to contract, distances shortening as attention aligned in a single direction. Evelyn felt the stillness settle into her bones, familiar yet altered, as if the ground itself were waiting. She did not step back or forward. She did not lower her head. She simply stood, the echo of her small kindness still warm in her chest, unaware that it had been noticed, not by the crowd that dismissed it, but by someone whose gaze did not miss what others overlooked. As the presence at the edge of the square drew closer, bringing with it an undeniable gravity, Evelyn held herself as she was, not as she had been labeled, carrying the quiet certainty that whatever came next would be shaped not only by power, but by the moments of humanity that had already begun to change the air. The presence became unmistakable before Evelyn fully saw him, a steady gravity that pulled attention inward and quieted the square without a word. Conversations fell away, replaced by a reverent stillness that felt practiced, instinctive, as if everyone present had been trained by years of distance to recognize authority when it arrived. The officials straightened, their earlier impatience dissolving into alert composure, and the clerk lowered his pen, eyes fixed on the path opening through the crowd. Evelyn felt it then, the subtle shift in the air she had sensed building, now complete, and she lifted her head fully for the first time without bracing for disappointment. The Alpha King stepped into the square with an ease that did not hurry and did not pause, a measured stride that claimed space by existing within it. He wore no excess, no unnecessary display, yet everything about him spoke of command, from the way the guards moved aside without instruction to the way the banners seemed to hold still in his wake. His gaze swept the square once, not searching, not assessing value, but taking in the whole, and when it passed over Evelyn, something in her chest tightened, not painfully, but with the sharp awareness of being truly seen. She did not bow, not because she meant to defy him, but because her body forgot the habit, caught between the old rules she had lived by and the unfamiliar pull of his attention. The Alpha King paused near the platform, close enough now that Evelyn could see the calm focus in his expression, the absence of judgment where she had learned to expect it. He did not look at the ledger or the officials first. He looked at her, and the silence deepened, thick with anticipation and uncertainty. Evelyn felt her breath steady as she met his gaze, not challenging, not pleading, simply present. She wondered if he saw the labels others had pressed onto her, or if he saw something else entirely, the small choices, the quiet endurance, the humanity she had guarded carefully because it was the only thing that truly belonged to her. The Alpha King spoke then, his voice even and clear, carrying easily without force, acknowledging the proceedings with a few measured words that were not a reprimand, but a reset, a reminder that this moment existed within a larger order. The clerk nodded quickly, swallowing his earlier confidence, and the crowd shifted again, this time not with unease, but with expectation. Evelyn felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones, grounding her rather than bending her, and she realized that whatever followed would be witnessed by everyone present. The Alpha King turned his attention fully to the platform, to the space Evelyn occupied, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that distance, the few yards between them charged with meaning. She thought of the girl she had helped moments before, of the simple act that had cost her nothing and changed nothing, and yet it felt necessary all the same. She wondered if that was what the Alpha King had noticed, not her condition or her history, but the way she had chosen to act when no one was watching closely. His gaze softened fractionally, not into indulgence, but into consideration, and Evelyn felt a strange, steady calm take hold, the kind that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. She stood as she was, shoulders squared by experience rather than pride, and waited, aware that the story being told about her was no longer hers alone, and that the next words spoken in this square would reshape not only her fate, but the assumptions of everyone who had gathered to witness it. The Alpha King did not speak again right away, and the silence that followed was heavier than any announcement could have been. It spread through the square slowly, deliberately, until even the smallest movements felt too loud, a held breath shared by hundreds of people who suddenly understood that the familiar rhythm of transactions and outcomes had been suspended. Evelyn felt the pause settle into her muscles, not as fear, but as a strange clarity, the kind that came when there was nothing left to anticipate because whatever happened next would arrive on its own terms. The clerk shifted his weight, glancing down at the ledger as if seeking refuge in ink and lines, then back up again, uncertain whether to continue or to wait. No one prompted him. No one dared. The Alpha King stood with his attention fixed on the platform, on Evelyn, on the space she occupied as if it mattered in a way the square had never acknowledged before. Evelyn's thoughts quieted, memories falling away until there was only the present, the feel of solid stone beneath her feet, the steady rhythm of her breath, the awareness that she was no longer being measured against expectations she could never meet. She did not try to explain herself with her posture or her expression. She simply existed, trusting that whatever the Alpha King saw now was unfiltered by rumor or record. Somewhere behind her, a whispered comment rose and died, quickly smothered by the tension in the air, and Evelyn realized that the crowd was waiting not for her, but for him, for a decision that would either restore the familiar order or fracture it beyond repair. The Alpha King's gaze shifted briefly, sweeping the assembled officials, the guards, the faces of those who had spoken so easily about her moments earlier. There was no accusation in his expression, only awareness, as if he were cataloging the unspoken assumptions that had shaped this place for years. When his eyes returned to Evelyn, the stillness sharpened, focusing inward. She felt a faint tremor run through her hands and steadied them, fingers lacing together, grounding herself in the simple certainty that she had endured every outcome so far. The clerk cleared his throat again, this time stopping himself before sound emerged, and lowered his eyes, waiting. Time stretched, Not long enough to be counted, but long enough to matter. Evelyn felt the weight of that waiting press against her chest, and with it came an unexpected thought, not of rescue or reward, but of choice, the quiet realization that even now, she was choosing how to stand, how to meet this moment without shrinking. The Alpha King drew a breath, subtle but perceptible, and the square seemed to lean toward him as one. Evelyn's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the recognition that this was the threshold, the point at which silence would turn into declaration. She wondered, fleetingly, if the world would sound different afterward, if the air would feel lighter or heavier, if she would recognize herself on the other side of whatever words were coming. The Alpha King took one step closer to the platform, closing the distance just enough to make the choice in front of him undeniable. Evelyn did not move. She did not bow or look away. She held his gaze with the quiet strength she had built over years of being overlooked, her expression calm, open, unguarded. The silence reached its limit, taut as a drawn line, and in that suspended moment, before any words were spoken, Evelyn understood that the decision about to be made was not merely about selection or status, but about what would be acknowledged as valuable from this moment forward, and whether the truth of who she was would finally be spoken aloud. The Alpha King spoke at last, and his voice did not rise to claim attention because it did not need to. It carried through the square with calm authority, steady and unmistakable, and the sound of it seemed to settle the air rather than disturb it. He addressed the proceedings in plain terms, acknowledging the ritual, the rules, the expectations that had governed choices here for generations, and then he stopped, letting the weight of that acknowledgement land before moving beyond it. Evelyn felt every eye shift, felt the moment tighten, and though her heart beat faster, her posture did not change. The Alpha King turned slightly, enough that the crowd could see his profile, his focus unwavering, and he stated that a choice would be made now, here, in full view, not as an exception, but as a declaration. A murmur rippled outward, restrained but electric, and the clerk stiffened, pen forgotten. The Alpha King's gaze returned to the platform, to Evelyn, and the world seemed to narrow to that exchange, the distance between them charged with meaning. He said her name clearly, without hesitation, Evelyn Hart, and the sound of it spoken that way sent a jolt through her chest, not pain, not fear, but recognition. For a fraction of a second, she wondered if she had misheard, if this was some formal clarification meant to close her case and move on, but the Alpha King continued, his words precise, leaving no room for doubt. He said that he chose her, openly, deliberately, before all. The square fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that followed something irreversible. Evelyn felt her body freeze, not from terror, but from the sudden absence of every outcome she had prepared herself for. Chosen. The word echoed through her, colliding with years of being passed over, returned, dismissed, until she could not immediately reconcile it with reality. She looked at him, truly looked, searching for irony or mistake, and found none. His expression held no indulgence, no condescension, only certainty. The clerk dropped his gaze to the ledger, then looked up again. Confusion etched across his face as he realized that the usual sequence no longer applied. Someone in the crowd inhaled sharply. Another whispered her name, disbelief threading the syllables. Evelyn's hands trembled, and she steadied them, grounding herself in the solidity of the platform, the fact of her own breath. The Alpha King took another step closer, stopping at the base of the platform, close enough that the space between them felt intentional. He clarified his choice with measured words, stating that it was made with full awareness of the labels that had been attached to her, and with complete disregard for them. He said that value was not defined by utility alone, and that the capacity for care, restraint, and quiet courage carried weight that could not be recorded in any ledger. The crowd shifted uneasily, confronted with a definition that left no place for comfortable assumptions. Evelyn felt the warmth rise behind her eyes, not tears, but the fierce effort of staying present as the world she knew rearranged itself around her. She did not speak. She did not need to. The Alpha King extended his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation made unmistakable by context and intent. The gesture was simple, unadorned, yet it carried the full force of his declaration. Evelyn looked at his hand, then at his face, and for the first time since stepping onto the platform, she allowed herself to believe that this moment was real. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his, her fingers cool but steady. The contact was brief, respectful, and the reaction it sparked in the square was immediate, a collective intake of breath as the meaning settled. The Alpha King turned with her hand in his, presenting the choice he had made to everyone present without raising his voice or repeating himself. Evelyn stood beside him, no longer alone on the platform, her spine straight, her gaze level, feeling the weight of countless eyes and discovering, with quiet astonishment, that she could bear it. The square, the ritual, the assumptions that had defined her moments earlier all shifted at once, and in that shift, Evelyn understood that she had not been saved from her story, but written into it anew, not as property or exception, but as a choice made openly, deliberately, and without apology. The square did not erupt into chaos or protest as some might have expected, but into a stunned stillness that felt heavier than noise. People looked at one another as if seeking confirmation that what they had witnessed was real, that the Alpha King had not misspoken, that the rules they had relied upon had not just shifted beneath their feet. The clerk stood frozen, ledger forgotten, his authority evaporated by a choice that rendered his procedures irrelevant. Evelyn remained where she was, her hand still lightly held, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her body in slow waves. The Alpha King released her hand gently and turned to face the officials, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, the embodiment of a decision already made. He spoke again, calmly, addressing the questions forming in their expressions before any could be voiced. He stated that the proceedings as they had been conducted were concluded, that the matter of Evelyn Hart was no longer subject to sale, record, or negotiation, and that any previous claims upon her were null by his word. The clarity of his statement left no space for argument, and the officials bowed their heads in acknowledgement, some with relief, others with visible discomfort. Evelyn watched as the world she had navigated for so long reorganized itself around a new center, one that no longer placed her at the margins. A few members of the crowd shifted closer, curiosity overcoming caution, while others stepped back, unsettled by the implications of what they had seen. The Alpha King's gaze swept them all, not with threat, but with expectation, and he spoke of accountability, of the ease with which worth had been reduced to a single measure, and of the cost of such simplicity. His words were not accusatory, but they carried the quiet weight of truth, and Evelyn felt a strange sense of vindication not because anyone apologized, but because the assumptions that had bound her were being named aloud. She stood beside him, her presence no longer incidental, and felt a subtle change in how eyes met her, no longer sliding away or lingering with pity, but adjusting, recalibrating. The younger Omega she had helped earlier stood near the steps, watching with wide eyes, and when her gaze met Evelyn's, there was something like hope there, tentative but real. Evelyn offered a small nod, grounding herself in that connection as the Alpha King concluded his address. He turned back to her then, his expression softening slightly, and asked if she would walk with him. It was a simple question, spoken without presumption, and Evelyn felt the significance of being asked rather than instructed settle into her bones. She answered yes, her voice steady, surprising herself with how natural it felt to speak in this moment. As they moved together across the square, the crowd parted, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet, each step deliberate, the familiar ache of uncertainty tempered by a growing sense of presence. She was not being carried away from her past, but forward with it acknowledged. At the edge of the square, the Alpha King paused, turning slightly so that their path remained visible to all. He stated that what had been witnessed was not an anomaly, but a standard he intended to uphold. That choice made with clarity and respect would define the future more than any ledger ever could. The words settled into the crowd like seeds, their impact not immediate, but inevitable. Evelyn stood at his side, feeling the last echoes of the square behind her, and understood that the confrontation she had endured was giving way to recognition, not because she had changed, but because the world around her was being asked to do so. As they stepped beyond the boundary of the square, the noise of the crowd faded into a low murmur, and Evelyn carried with her the quiet certainty that she had crossed not into safety alone, but into a space where her existence was no longer conditional, and where the story ahead would be shaped not by what she lacked, but by what she had always been. Evelyn walked beside the Alpha King beyond the edge of the square, and with each step the noise of the crowd softened until it became a distant hum, like the memory of a storm after the sky had cleared. The path opened into a quieter avenue lined with stone and early morning light, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she noticed the feel of the air without bracing herself against it. The Alpha King slowed, not to lead, but to match her pace, an unspoken acknowledgement that this moment belonged to both of them. He spoke quietly, not as a ruler addressing a subject, but as a man grounding a choice, telling her that what had happened was not meant to erase her past, but to honor it, because endurance without recognition was not the same as strength, and she had shown both. Evelyn listened, her attention steady, absorbing the words without rushing to understand them all at once. She realized that she did not need every answer immediately, only the certainty that she would be heard as questions arose. They paused where the avenue widened, sunlight catching on stone and metal, and the Alpha King turned to face her fully. He asked her how she felt, a simple question that carried weight because it assumed her feelings mattered. Evelyn considered her response carefully, then spoke honestly, saying that she felt uncertain and hopeful and steady all at once, emotions that did not cancel each other out but existed together, like balance found after a long crossing. He nodded, accepting the complexity without trying to simplify it, and told her that the future he envisioned would be built the same way, with patience, clarity, and choice made openly. As they stood there, a small group approached at a respectful distance, representatives tasked with formalities, but the Alpha King raised a hand, granting them permission to wait, and the gesture reinforced something Evelyn was beginning to understand, that urgency no longer dictated her worth. She thought of the square behind them, of the younger Omega watching with cautious hope, of the many others who would hear what had happened and measure their own possibilities against it. The Alpha King spoke again, this time about the days ahead, about a journey that would not be hidden or hurried, about introductions made with transparency rather than spectacle, and about a place where Evelyn would not be expected to perform gratitude for dignity already owed. The words settled into her with a quiet warmth, not overwhelming, but sustaining. Evelyn felt her shoulders ease, the tension she had carried for years loosening in increments she could feel rather than see. She told him that she would walk forward with him, not because she was rescued, but because she chose to accept the path he offered, and he received her answer with the same respect he had shown from the beginning. They turned together then, not back toward the square, but toward the road beyond it, and the movement felt symbolic without being staged, a simple decision embodied in motion. As they walked, Evelyn became aware of something subtle and profound, that her name, spoken earlier with certainty, now followed her with intention, no longer a mark in a ledger, but a promise carried forward. The Alpha King glanced at her, a faint smile touching his expression, and said that the world would adjust, as it always did when truth was spoken clearly. Evelyn looked ahead, the road stretching into light, and felt a steady resolve take root, understanding that the justice she had witnessed was not loud or fleeting, but durable, the kind that reshaped lives quietly and completely. She breathed in, filling her lungs without restraint, and stepped forward into the future not as someone chosen to fill a gap, but as someone recognized for who she was, carrying with her the certainty that true strength was gentle, and that love, when grounded in respect, had the power to redeem not only one life, but many.